I'm going to point the examiner's report, 1510. The Federal Reserve Bank, New York, was aware that Lehman was overstating its liquidity. Is that a true statement?
I don't know that that's a fair statement. What I would say, and I'll echo what the chairman said, is that there is nothing in that experience that did anything but confirm our judgment, Mr. Baucus, that Lehman was vulnerable to this gathering storm, both in terms of how much leverage it had and in terms of how it was funding itself. We were deeply concerned about that.
The Federal Reserve Bank was aware that Lehman was overstating its liquidity.
I don't understand the gentleman from Alabama's approach here. He had plenty of time. He raised some other issues. It's my responsibility to try and give every member a chance. I asked one of my colleagues on the Democratic side to stop a very important statement. We cannot run the committee with people just talking whatever they want without regard to the time. Now, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes to add to my procedural dismay, frankly, some substantive dismay. I am disappointed at the partisan tone here. First of all, let's be very clear. The primary responsibility here was in the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's what Mr. Valukas says. Despite Chairman Cox's statement, we believe it is clear that the SEC was Lehman's primary regulator. Page 6 of Mr. Valukas' testimony. Mr. Cox was a Republican member of this committee, appointed by President Bush to head the SEC, partly because he thought that his predecessor, whom he'd also appointed, was too interventionist, Mr. Donaldson. This effort to put it all on the Fed and diminish the role of the SEC is a fairly transparent partisan effort. It doesn't solve our purpose. We are here to try and make sure that this doesn't happen again. That's our major role. Now, the other thing I have to respond to is this blatant mischaracterization that we are trying to put capital into these companies. The gentleman from Alabama began by saying he disagrees with us. I think he meant the Democrats, because we want to put capital into the company. He incorrectly imputed that statement to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, who made it clear he'd never said it. He then said, well, the chairman said that was a tool they might have had back then. The chairman's a very nice fellow. Doesn't speak for the Democrats, nor we for him. The bill that we have, as the secretary made it clear, is very explicit. No money can be spent in these cases until the institution is out of business. The notion that we inject capital into the institution is flatly wrong, flatly contradicted by the text of the bill. The point is that we put money in at the suggestion of the head of the FDIC, Ms. Baer, another Republican appointee whom I admire greatly, who says her experience is that when you are putting an institution out of business, as she does with banks, you need some money to do that in a way that does not cause greater systemic problem and, in fact, can minimize the cost to the government. That's what the money is there for. Whether it's there before or after doesn't seem to me terribly important. What's important is that none of that money can be spent to help the institution. None of it goes. So the suggestion, not the suggestion, the statement that there's an effort to inject capital into these institutions is simply, flatly, and clearly wrong. Now, the other point I would want to make is this to Ms. Shapiro, because we've been told, well, you know, they had all the authority, etc. But I believe that there were a couple of decisions made by the SEC under Chairman Cox, whose statement we put in the record. Chairman Cox and Secretary Paulson, by the way, both contradict my Republican colleagues. Those two appointees of President Bush said no, they didn't have all the authority they should have had, and they wanted to have had more authority, and they support efforts to give more authority here. But let me ask Chairwoman Shapiro, the SEC made a couple of decisions. One, to increase the amount of leverage that entities were allowed, and two, to give them a kind of voluntary regulatory approach. Would it be fair to say that that contributed to the context in which this happened, and have we taken action to undo that?
Mr. Chairman, the Consolidated Supervised Entity Program had to be voluntary because there was no authority in statute for the SEC to bring investment bank holding companies under the regulatory umbrella. So when the EU directive required consolidated supervision for these institutions, the SEC, I believe at the time, felt it was stepping up to the plate to offer a consolidated supervisor so that they would be regulated.
What would the current legislation, the pending legislation, do in regard to that?
Well, the current legislation would give a systemic risk regulator the tools to see all of the entities and affiliated entities across the institution, which I think is very important. In return for coming into this voluntary program and submitting to holding company regulation by the SEC, the Commission permitted the broker-dealers of these institutions to calculate their net capital in a different way, utilizing the alternative net capital rule, which took away the prescribed haircuts and instead allowed the firms to use value-at-risk models.
Well, let me ask you, with the new authority that you would get if the bill passed, would that still be allowed?
The rules would still be allowed, although there are no consolidated supervised entities any longer. Presumably under the legislation, they would be subject, these kinds of entities, to the systemic risk regulator and the oversight of the council. The alternative net capital rules do still exist. They have been cut back rather dramatically, and it's a question we're debating right now within the agency to eliminate them in their entirety. The effect they had in 2004 was to allow firms, by use of their models, to support larger and larger positions against the same capital base that they had historically. To counterbalance that, though, they were required to hold $5 billion in early warning net capital and to have a liquidity pool, which raises all of its own issues, sufficient to cover their costs for a year if unsecured lending were unavailable. So there were trade-offs and balances. The agency felt it was bringing the holding companies into the regulatory sphere, but at the same time it loosened some of the ties on firms.